So, welcome to week 2. This is the first video of week 2. What are we going to be doing this week? Well, we're moving to the modern history of the philosophy of time. By modern there, I mean the sort of historical period starting around the time of the Renaissance or shortly after, the Enlightenment style period between those two. So you're talking about 1600 onwards. And we're going to look at that, and in particular, so I'll explain what this is in a minute. We've touched upon it in the first week, the substantivalist relationist debate. I'll say a bit about that in a minute, and some of the key figures in that debate. It was that was the key debate in the philosophy of time during this period. So René Descartes, we're going to talk about his view. René Descartes was a relationist, so I'll just give you a kind of overview of where the people we'll be looking at stand in the debate. René Descartes was a relationist. Isaac Newton, he was a substantivalist, so disagreed with Descartes. And then Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who was a relationist, and he disagreed with Newton. So we've got that kind of relationist, substantivalist, relationist. Those are the three positions. And then we're also going to have a look at Immanuel Kant's views, who was sort of neither a substantivalist or a relationist. Sort of, and Kant's views are a bit more complicated, I think, and we'll come to that. Although there's a sense as well in which Leibniz was neither a substantivalist or a relationist either. So we'll see that in fact Leibniz and Kant are perhaps a little bit more complicated with regards to where they stand with that. But Leibniz should be understood, I think, as a relationist, and I'll say about that as we go. But in this video, I'm going to be introducing the issue, saying a bit about Descartes. I'm going to try and give you a bit of background as well, so I like to fill in a little bit more background than I give in the textbook, because as I've said, I don't just want to parrot the textbook at you. I like to give a bit of extra background. Okay, so let's start with an introduction to these two views. What are they all about? The first one, substantivalism, is we're to think here of, so it's a view really about both space and time, or time and space, and it's the idea that space itself, or points in space, so we don't necessarily have to think of space as a single entity. Space might be made up of an array of points. That's generally in fact how we think of space. And time, and again, we don't have to think about that as a single entity. It might be made up of points. So space, or points in space, and time, or points in space, are supposed to be on some substantivalism entities in their own right. They're meant to exist independently of material objects, and material objects are then thought of as being in space and time. So space and time are thought of as like a box or a container, and the material objects are in it, right? So that's a substantivalist view. Okay, hopefully that's clear enough. You're to think about it like that. Are space and time like independently existing things which material objects kind of sit in? Yeah. So you can think about, if you've got a blank canvas, the canvas, as it were, is a thing in its own right, and if you draw stuff on it, the things that you draw are kind of on the canvas. So it's a bit like that. Substantivalism, space and time are like the canvas, and material objects are like the things you draw on the canvas. Hope that's relatively clear. Relationism, by contrast, is the idea that space, or points in space, or time and points in time, are not independently existing things, but they're constituted by the relations that hold between the material objects. So a way of thinking about this one is to think, so we had the canvas metaphor. These are metaphors, but they're meant to help you to get a grip on this. So in substantivalism, we had the metaphor of the canvas and then the drawings on the canvas. Relationism is more, well, space and time aren't really like a canvas. It's more like if you build a model, right? So if you build a model and you put, I don't know, like a sculpture made up of different things, it's almost like before you create the model, there's nothing there independently. Once you create the model, the model is constituted by the relations between the things that you build. I don't know whether that is a good metaphor or not, but I'm trying to think of a way of explaining it. But I hope you see the idea. According to relationism, it's not like space and time exist separately from the things in space and time. Another way of thinking about it is to think, so as I've said, sometimes you need to sort of give about 3 or 4 different ways of thinking about things and to try to get a handle on it. Another way of thinking about the two views is this. Could you have a completely empty universe, that is, a universe that exists even though there are no material objects at all? And the substantivalist will say yes, because you could have time and space existing but no material objects whatsoever located within it, right? So relationism will say no, you can't have space and time existing without anything in it, so you couldn't have a universe containing no material objects whatsoever. You have to have material objects in order to get space and time, right? So those are the two views. Hopefully they'll become clearer. So that's an abstract explanation. It should be able to give you some grip on it, but they'll come clearer as we go through the different views. And I'm going to start going through those views really in the next video. So in the next video I'll tell you about Descartes' position on all of this, but I'm going to start with a bit of background about Descartes. So there he is, doing his Robert De Niro impression. And you get the sort of the basics. Well, his remarks upon this are scattered throughout his work. It's not like he's got a work in particular where he deals with time and space, but the sort of bits here and there. So, but if we take his Principles of Philosophy, so this was one of his major works that was written a short time after the Meditations, which you might be aware of. I'm going to say a little bit about the Meditations in a minute. He says these are some just snippets really, and I'm giving you these snippets because it's quite easy to misinterpret Descartes on this, and we need to be clear about it. So here's a snippet. He says time is nothing but a mode of thought, and he also says time is the name we give to the duration of the greatest and most regular motions which give rise to years and days. So if you think about those two little snippets, they do suggest a view which isn't in fact the correct way of interpreting. So the idea here that time is nothing but a mode of thought suggests that in some sense time is mind dependent, right? That there's some sense in which the mind creates time. That's what it suggests, I think, in line with Aristotle's view, right? So Aristotle talks about the idea that time is mind dependent in some sense. As we've seen, although Aristotle's view is hard to understand and difficult, he's got that view. And this here, the duration, time is the name we give to the duration of the greatest and most regular motions which give rise to the years and days. Here, I suppose it suggests the planets, the movement of the planets, and the idea of the regular motions of the planets. So something to do with the idea that time has got something to do with the external objects in the universe which change and so on. And that should remind you of Plato's view. So we saw last week that Plato had this idea that time is introduced into the universe as a reflection of the eternal nature of the forms, and time is in that sense dependent upon the regular movements of the planets, right? Or the entire universe on Plato's view, which revolves and returns to its own point. Doesn't matter too much don't worry too much about remembering those two views, but all I'm saying here is this is the suggestion. It suggests that he thinks these two things, that time is dependent for its existence on the operations of the mind, and it suggests that he thinks that time can be identified with the regular motion of the celestial bodies, right? Now, he thinks neither of these two things. So although it's easy when reading Descartes to think that he thinks this, he doesn't. And to see, by the way, that he can't really think these two things, notice that between 1 and 2 there's a kind of a tension, at least a tension once you take into account Descartes' further views. I mean, it's not a controversial further view. So Descartes let me put it like this. If 1 and 2 were true, that time is dependent on for its existence on the mind, and we also identify time with the motions of the planets, let's say, well, that would mean that the motions of the planets would have to depend upon the existence of the operations, would have to depend upon the operations of the mind. That is, the way the planets move would have to be a mind-dependent matter. And that's certainly not what Descartes thinks. He thinks that the existence of the planets and their movement and so on is independent of the human mind. So you can't hold these two views together if you think that. So these two views turn out to be inconsistent given that, and therefore it can't be Descartes' view. There are other reasons for thinking, so that's to say these two things are inconsistent with each other, given the view that the planets exist independently of the mind. There are other reasons for thinking that for establishing that he doesn't hold these two views. So in the next video I'm going to go on to to explain what his real view is. But before we get to that, I wanted to go to and talk about a little bit of background then. So let's open up. They've installed on my computer a Microsoft whiteboard, so I'll be using this one. It seems a bit better than that thing I was using before. So okay. So alright, the first thing I want to say is, let's not be confused about Descartes' overall position. So there's a sense in which there's a kind of let's make this straight. There's a as straight as I can. You'll have seen last year, or you remember from last year, that we had like this kind of rationalism-empiricism. What might we call it? Rationalism-empiricism continuum. And some philosophers fall on the empiricist side of things, others fall on the rationalist side. So the empiricists were broadly those people who think that we have to rely upon sense experience to find out about the world. And if you remember, key figures here were Hume, Locke, Berkeley. Oops, that's L-O-C-K-E. Anyway, Berkeley. So these were the British empiricists, and that was empiricism. And Descartes fell somewhere on the rationalist side of things. I want to first of all say that this is true that Descartes was a rationalist, but when we're thinking about him in the context of the philosophy of time, he's not to be thought of as a rationalist, but rather as an empiricist. So I want to make this clear. So a rationalist is someone who thinks that there's some sense in which our knowledge of the world, we can use our pure rationality to find out about the world and not use experiment. And that's true of Descartes, but I'll explain in a minute. It's only true of a kind of foundational sense. It's like Descartes establishes using pure rationalistic methods that we can find out about the world, and then kind of switches to an empiricist mode of thought. Right? And that's going to be kind of important to understand. So I'll say that again in case that wasn't particularly, or in case it needs saying again to clarify. Descartes is a rationalist, but he goes through a certain rationalist procedure, a certain rationalist way of thinking. He comes to a particular conclusion that we can find out about the external world using empirical methods. So once he's done with that foundational bit of his thinking, that's the rationalist bit of his thinking, you can then think of him as being an empiricist. And when he's talking about time and space, he's in his empiricist mode of thought. So just to kind of fill in some of Descartes was he was a very practical man in many respects. He was known, for example, he used to buy carcasses from butchers so he could cut them up, or dead animals from butchers so he could cut them up and look at their insides. And he was doing empirical work. He was trying to understand the nature of the world by looking around at things, using scientific methods. So in that sense he was an empiricist, but he needed his rationalist principles to get him going on that. Okay, so let's see if we can explain that. So I think I've got a thing here, clear canvas, hey. So alright, the place where he really does his foundational work is in the Meditations, and you should already be aware of the Meditations, but I'm going to give a very quick overview. So Meditation 1, 6 meditations, Meditation 2, and this was his attempt to try to put knowledge on a secure footing, right? And often I think people pay attention to the first meditation, where Descartes is a skeptic. That is, he doubts. So this is the method of doubt in Meditation 1, method of doubt. So I'm going to try and give you an overview of the entire Meditations to see that by the end of the Meditations, Descartes is then an empiricist. So this is his rationalist sort of foundational method, which gives rise to his empiricism. Okay, so in the first meditation, the method of doubt, he goes through, and this will be familiar with you. He thinks, well, what can we know? What can we know about the external world? And he seems to come to the conclusion at the end of the first meditation that we can't really know anything at all about the external world, because there may be a deceiving demon, right? Some sort of an all-powerful demon that is making us seem to us that everything that we see around us is in fact real, when in fact it's just an illusion, and so on and so forth. That's the first meditation. And if you conclude from that Descartes was a skeptic, you'd be wrong, because the rest of the meditations is his answer to that doubt, right? So by the end of the first meditation, he said, yeah, look, I can't know anything about the world at all. But in meditation 2, he says, well, there are some things I can know. We get the cogito in there. So he says, look, that's the I'm thinking, therefore I am. So he thinks, well, look, there are some things I can know. I can know that I exist. And he says, I can also know that the contents of my sense perceptions exist, right? So sense perceptions exist. With certainty, this is. So, think about it like this. I can know that I exist, because a demon couldn't make me go wrong about that. That's the cogito. I'm thinking, therefore I am. But he also knows, for example, that he's having perceptions as of seeing the world. So suppose you're looking at, let's use a table. Suppose you're looking at a table. You might not know at this point that the table exists, at this point in the meditations, but what you can know is that you are having a sense experience as of seeing the table, right? So he does think he can know things about his own mind, in other words, including the sense perceptions that are going on within it, and he can know those with certainty. In meditation 3, he then uses that, so from we'll put ideas, so we can think about sense perceptions more broadly as the ideas that go through our mind, from ideas to God. So he thinks that he can establish from introspection into his own ideas that God exists. So he establishes in this meditation that God exists. Once he's got God, in meditation 4, God is no deceiver. God is no deceiver. So he thinks he can establish that, God exists and God wouldn't deceive us into going wrong about the existence of an external world, in effect. Then in meditation 5, he goes on to talk about the idea that, this is where the empiricism gets introduced, where he kind of says, I'll put it like this. So even though we've got the existence of God, it's not like we can just believe everything that our senses tell us. God doesn't make it that easy for us. The idea is that if we are careful, i.e. we use empirical methods, we can gain knowledge of the external world, okay? Backed by God. Knowledge, we can gain knowledge of reality. Well, external reality, we would think. Meditation 6, by the way, it's not going to be too important for our purposes, but this is where he thinks he can establish that the mind and body are distinct. Okay, mind and body distinct. It's meditation 5, so 1 to 5, which is the key thing here. So just to sort of recap this, Descartes is in the meditations using this kind of rationalist method of trying to establish that God exists. And if God exists, that God wouldn't deceive us. And if God's not a deceiver, then if we're careful about how we go about trying to find out about the world, that is by using empirical methods, then we can gain real knowledge of reality. We can be certain that the knowledge we gain about how external reality works is true. So we can have certain knowledge. I hope that makes sense. So I just wanted to give this background to try to situate Descartes' thinking. So, once he's done with the meditations, I thought I couldn't know anything about external reality because of the deceiving demon argument. Actually, that doesn't work because God exists, and I can establish that using the argument from ideas to God. Once I've got God, then that's going to enable me to find out about the world using empirical methods. Right? That's the basic idea. By the way, I don't think it works, so this is kind of like an aside, but I'll quickly mention it. The key bit really in the Meditations is this, from ideas to God. So this argument for the existence of God. By the way, he gives a second argument for the existence of God in Meditation 5. It's unclear why he gives a second one. I mean, he's already given one in Meditation 3, so why give another one in Meditation 5 unless you think the first one doesn't work? I've always been a bit puzzled why Descartes gives two arguments for the existence of God. If anyone can think of why he might do that, I don't know. Anyway, doesn't matter. But this is the key argument in Meditation 3 for his rationalist method to work. So I'm not saying, by the way, that Descartes' view is correct. I'm just trying to explain his view. And in particular, his argument in Meditation 3 is a bit dodgy. And I don't know whether you've ever been given it, but I'll clear this. I'll try and give that for you. So where are we? Clear canvas. Yeah, so how does his argument actually work? And important here is to realise that Descartes, he is a crossover thinker between rationalism and empiricism. It's like you see this shift from rationalism to empiricism in Descartes' work, and partly it's down to this argument for the existence of God. So he was brought up in a little village called La Haye, now called La Haye Descartes after him, in France, and he attended a Jesuit college, a religious college, and there he had his main sort of education. He later went on to become, he trained in law, didn't like that very much. He joined the Dutch army. He seemed to like that, although he didn't really do that much soldiering. He ended up actually in, so because his views were considered dangerous in France, he was well aware that, for example, Galileo had been persecuted for his views about the Earth being in the centre of the universe. Sorry, about the Sun being in the centre of the universe, or the centre of the solar system. Anyway, Descartes had similar views, and he fled to Holland, where he spent the rest of his time apparently walking around, smoking a lot of dope, and yeah, I think I'd probably get on well with Descartes. He seems like a nice enough kind of a sound bloke. Anyway, irrelevant. So, okay, let's consider this argument that he gives. So he's got this. The point about mentioning that he was brought up in this Jesuit college is that he had a lot of scholastic training. So the scholastics are the people who were they were rationalists, and they were really focused on Aristotle's philosophy and how you can kind of make it fit with Christianity. And Descartes is imbued with a lot of these ideas which we wouldn't really hold nowadays. So anyway, let me explain. Let's see. So Descartes makes this distinction between ideas in the mind and things in the external world. So if we put over here ideas in the mind, and these are things that we can be certain of, right, because we just have to look into our own mind. A demon couldn't make us go wrong about the ideas in the mind. And then we've got things in reality, that is in the external world, if you like. And he wants to say that ideas in the mind have what's called representative reality, and things in reality have actual reality. These aren't the terms he uses, but the terms he uses are a bit confusing, so we'll call them this. Actual reality. So, you can understand things in the mind, we represent things in the actual world. So, ideas in the mind have representative reality, things in reality have actual reality. Okay? And by the way, these arrows here are representing, he thought these came in scales, so things higher up on this scale have greater representative reality, and things higher up on this scale over here have greater actual reality. So, let's think about what's in the mind. On the one hand, I'm going to draw three squares here. On the one hand, we've got ideas of properties, which he thought were right down the bottom of this scale. So here, for example, we've got the idea of squareness. Squareness. Gone outside the box anyway. So, when you think about a square, part of what's going on, the idea in your mind is that it's got the property of being square. Okay, that's fair enough. Then above that, he thinks we've got ideas of finite substances. Ideas of finite substances. And those are tables and chairs and things like that. But also importantly, so I'll put in e.g. tables, that's a finite substance, and also ourselves. So we've got ideas of our own self. And we're finite substances, so you can reflect and you can think, I've got an idea of myself, that I'm a finite substance. So these are then the next, and then finally, at the top of this scale, we've got ideas of infinite substance, infinite substance, that's meant to say, sorry about the writing. And there, the example is God. Okay, so God's an infinite substance. So if I reflect upon my own mind, I can see that I've got ideas of properties, squareness, I've got ideas of finite substances, tables, and myself, and I've got an idea of an infinite substance, for example, God. So look inside my own mind, I've got all of those things. So these are just purely within the mind. Now, I won't draw this out in sort of great detail, but if these things actually do exist in the world, then, right, the idea of property represents a property actually in reality, and that has got the lowest level of actual reality according to Descartes. Then there are finite substances in the world if our ideas do represent them correctly, right? So you can think about the method of doubt as saying, how do we know that the ideas in the mind actually represent things in reality? That's the sort of what's going on when he's doing the method of doubt. How do we know that any of the things on this side actually reflect how things are on this side? That's the kind of skeptical worry. And then if our ideas of infinite substance match up to things in the world, then there really will be infinite substances in reality itself. Okay? So there's the basic setup. And then here's the dodgy move. He appeals to a principle which is scholastic. It's a scholastic principle. He would have thought it were true, and the scholastics thought it was true, but, I mean, we shouldn't really think it's true nowadays. And the principle is something, well, I'll state it like this. Things must have, okay, let's do it like this. Things in the mind must have at least as much representative reality, if I'm putting this right way around, as the things in reality have actual reality. Okay, so this is a dodgy principle, but we'll see how he puts it to work now. So he puts it to work in the following way. He says, well, okay, so if I've got an idea of a property, e.g. squareness, if the thing in... Oh, I have put it the wrong way around. Things in reality... Oh, I'm really sorry. Anyway, it should make sense when I explain. Things in reality must have at least as much actual reality as things in the mind have representative reality. It should be the other way around. Anyway, sorry about that. That might be a bit confusing, but I think you'll see how it works when I give the example. So he says, or I give the explanation, he says, okay, well, I've got this idea of a property. That must have been brought about in me by something in reality which has at least as much actual reality as the idea has representative reality. That's the thought. And it's like, well, okay, the idea of squareness, for example, could have been created by the property of squareness in reality. It could have been created by a finite substance, or it could have been created by an infinite substance within me. So when I think about the idea of a property, e.g. squareness, it could have been brought about in me by any of these things in reality. Then I'm supposed to think, well, okay, what about the idea of finite substance? That must have been brought about in me by something in reality with at least as much actual reality, so it could have been brought about by these two things. And you can see perhaps where this is going. Given that I've got the idea of an infinite substance, this can only have been brought about in me by an infinite substance, and that's the key step. So, you know, when I think about an idea of a finite substance, tables, chairs, all the rest, well, look, I'm over here. I am a finite substance, so I could have created that idea in my own mind, in a sense, right? I could have created the idea of tables and chairs and all the rest of it. That could have come from me, because I'm a finite substance. However, given that I've got this idea of an infinite substance, because I'm only a finite substance, that arrow there doesn't work, it doesn't go, and it can only have come from an infinite substance, only from here. I'll draw that arrow about 4 times to emphasize. Therefore, because I've got an idea of God, basically the only infinite substance when you take it to its conclusion, it must mean that there is an infinite substance in the world which has created that idea in me. So because I've got the idea of God, I must know that God actually exists in reality. Right? This gets called the trademark argument. So trademark argument. Trademark argument. Because the idea is that God has stamped, like a trademark, he's stamped the idea of himself within my mind. And I know that it must be from God, according to this argument, because I've not got the right amount of actual reality to create that idea in myself. Right? It must be. So, therefore, Descartes thinks that you can establish that God exists. And that's a kind of a key move in the Meditations that enables him to overcome, he thinks, the skeptical doubts of Meditation 1. So yeah, I hope that makes some kind of a sense. And the point is, once he's done this is the key thing, once he's done this, he then thinks, great, we can know about reality, because God isn't a deceiver, and he allows me to discover stuff about reality, and then he uses his empirical methods to do so. Okay. So anyway, that's all I'm going to say by way of background, and now we'll move to Descartes' views themselves on time. So I like to give a bit of background in these lectures. I think that it's worthwhile doing. So okay, let's move on to Descartes' ideas of time in the next video. Thanks.